63% of Americans cannot afford a $500 emergency expense. That means if their car breaks down, if they have a medical emergency, or if they suddenly lose their job, many have nowhere to turn except credit cards or loans with skyrocketing interest rates. At the same time, Americans now owe over $1 trillion in credit card debt, a record-breaking number that just keeps climbing. The cost of living is rising, wages aren't keeping up, and millions are trapped in a cycle of financial struggle. But here's the real question. How is this happening in the richest country in the world? Why more Americans are falling into poverty and why escaping it is harder than ever before? If you think this is just about bad spending habits, think again. This is about a system designed to keep people struggling. America is the wealthiest country in the world, yet millions of its citizens are struggling just to survive. This isn't just an economic problem, it's a national paradox. Let's break it down. Right now, over 37.9 million Americans live below the official poverty line. That's 11.6% of the entire U.S. population. And yet, these numbers don't even tell the full story, because the way poverty is measured in America is deeply flawed. The U.S. poverty rate is calculated using a system designed in the 1960s, a time when life was completely different. Back then, the average household spent about 1/3 of its income on food. So the government decided that poverty would be defined as earning 3 times the cost of a basic food diet. That formula has barely changed since 1963. But here's the problem. Today, food is not the biggest household expense. Housing, healthcare, childcare, and education are. The formula doesn't account for geographical differences, meaning someone living in New York or California is judged by the same poverty threshold as someone in rural Mississippi. It also ignores taxes, medical bills, and debt, all major financial burdens for struggling Americans. Because of this outdated system, millions of Americans who are technically above the poverty line are still financially drowning. They don't qualify for assistance, yet they can't afford basic necessities. Recognizing these flaws, economists and policymakers introduced the Supplemental Poverty Measure in 2011, which adjusts for cost of living differences and takes government benefits into account. However, even this improved measure is deeply flawed. It fails to fully capture the rising costs of housing, transportation, and medical expenses in high-cost areas. It also ignores the reality that many working-class families are just one emergency away from financial disaster, even if they don't fall below an arbitrary poverty line. Poverty in America isn't just about the 37 million classified as poor. It's about the tens of millions more who are one emergency away from losing everything. 140 million Americans, that's 40% of the population, are either poor or low income. More than 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, regardless of their income level. Even those earning 6 figures are struggling, thanks to inflation, housing costs, and debt. This means that poverty in the U.S. isn't just about the homeless or the jobless. It's about the working class. It's about people who have jobs, pay taxes, and follow the rules, yet still can't make ends meet. America is a country that produces more billionaires than any other nation. The stock market is at record highs. Corporate profits are booming. And yet, economic insecurity is rising, and millions are trapped in a financial system that works against them. How did we get here? Why is poverty so persistent in a nation with so much wealth? To answer that, we need to look at a turning point in history: the COVID-19 pandemic, which exposed and accelerated America's financial divide. For years, poverty in America had actually been declining. In 2012, 46.5 million Americans were living below the poverty line. By 2019, that number had fallen to 34 million. While the system was far from perfect, there was at least some progress. Then COVID-19 hit, and everything changed. The pandemic didn't just cause an economic crisis. It exposed one that had been quietly building for years. It revealed just how fragile financial security was for millions of Americans, especially those living paycheck to paycheck. And when businesses shut down, those living on the financial edge were the first to fall. At the peak of the crisis, over 20 million Americans lost their jobs overnight, pushing unemployment to 14.7%, the highest since the Great Depression. With no savings or safety net, many were left stranded. Industries like hospitality and retail never fully recovered, forcing millions into lower-paying jobs or long-term unemployment. Even as businesses reopened, wages lagged behind, leaving families struggling to stay afloat. The government responded with emergency relief, stimulus checks, expanded unemployment benefits, and a temporary child tax credit that lifted millions out of poverty. For a moment, poverty dropped, proving it's a policy choice. But when those benefits expired, everything fell apart. When the child tax credit ended in 2021, child poverty doubled in a year. Eviction moratoriums were lifted, inflation surged, and wages fell behind. What was meant to be temporary became permanent. leaving millions still struggling as costs keep rising. The pandemic didn't just create financial struggles, it deepened inequality. In 2021, the Gini index rose for the first time in a decade, widening the economic divide that existed before COVID. And the reality that few people talk about is that in America, being poor is extremely expensive. The truth is, the American economic system makes it extremely difficult for low-income families to move up the financial ladder. One of the biggest reasons Americans can't escape poverty is simple. They aren't paid enough. The federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 per hour since 2009. Despite the fact that inflation has drastically increased the cost of living. If wages had kept pace with worker productivity, the minimum wage today would be over $24 per hour, according to research from the Economic Policy Institute. This means that to afford basic necessities, a household needs to work more than 2 full-time minimum wage jobs just to break even. For single parents, the situation is even worse. The gap between the rich and the poor in America is wider than ever. The top 10% of earners now make 13 times more than the bottom 10%, according to U.S. Census Bureau data. The wealthiest Americans have seen their incomes grow exponentially over the past few decades, while the wages of the working class have stagnated. When wealth is concentrated at the top, it becomes harder for lower-income individuals to build savings, invest in education, or start businesses, all of which are critical for upward mobility. Poverty isn't just about wages, it's also about how expensive it is to live in America. Over the past 2 decades, housing, healthcare, and education costs have skyrocketed, far outpacing wage growth. Rent prices have increased by over 149% since 1985, while real wages have only grown by 16% in the same period. In cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment exceeds $2,500 per month. For millions, homeownership is out of reach, forcing them into a cycle of renting where landlords can raise prices at will. Medical expenses are a leading cause of bankruptcy in the U.S. In 2021, 66.5% of bankruptcies were tied to medical issues. Even with insurance, high deductibles and out-of-pocket costs can financially cripple low-income families. A college degree used to be a ticket to upward mobility. But today, student debt has surpassed $1.7 trillion, making it harder for graduates to build wealth or buy homes. Many Americans must choose between higher education or financial stability, because they can't afford both. With wages failing to match these rising costs, many Americans are forced to rely on credit cards, payday loans, or side hustles just to survive. And once trapped in debt, escaping becomes nearly impossible. While government assistance programs help many low-income Americans, the system is designed in a way that often traps people in poverty instead of lifting them out. Many social benefits, like food stamps, Medicaid, and housing assistance, have strict income limits. This means that if a low-income worker earns even a little more money, they can suddenly lose thousands of dollars in benefits. This is known as the welfare cliff, a situation where making an extra few dollars per hour can actually leave someone financially worse off. For example, a single mother receiving Medicaid and food assistance may be offered a job that pays slightly more than the eligibility threshold. But if she accepts it, she immediately loses healthcare coverage for her children, along with food benefits. Even though she is technically earning more, her overall financial situation worsens. Because of this, many low-income workers are forced to make a heartbreaking choice: stay in poverty to keep benefits or risk financial disaster by trying to move up. The system, rather than encouraging upward mobility, often forces people to remain dependent on assistance. For many families, poverty is not just a temporary setback. It is a cycle passed from one generation to the next. Children who grow up in poverty are statistically more likely to have lower educational outcomes, earn lower wages as adults, struggle with chronic health problems, face higher risks of eviction, homelessness, and food insecurity. A child born into poverty in America is significantly less likely to climb into the middle class compared to children in other developed nations. The U.S. has one of the lowest rates of social mobility among wealthy countries, meaning that where you are born often determines where you will stay. Unlike other developed nations, the U.S. also lacks universal programs like paid parental leave, childcare subsidies, or free healthcare. In countries like Canada and most of Europe, families receive child allowances, monthly payments that help with the cost of raising kids. But in America, parents often struggle to afford childcare, which can cost as much as rent or a mortgage in many states. Poverty is not an accident. It's the result of a rigged system. For millions of Americans, escaping poverty is not just about working harder. It's about overcoming an economic structure that is designed to keep them struggling. The question is, how can we fix it? The answer lies in policies that address the root causes of poverty, not just its symptoms. But first, we need to talk about another major problem: the broken U.S. welfare system that fails to protect those who need it most. Financial struggles don't just drain a person's bank account. They take a severe toll on mental and emotional well-being. Today, 72% of Americans feel stressed about money at least some of the time, making it the top source of stress nationwide. Adults living in poverty are twice as likely to suffer from mental disorders compared to those with stable finances. The impact goes beyond emotions. It affects decision-making, relationships, and overall quality of life. When people face chronic financial hardship, their brains enter survival mode, making it harder to plan, focus, or think long-term. Financial stress can lower cognitive function by up to 13 IQ points, the equivalent of losing an entire night's sleep. Debt in particular intensifies this burden. Many describe the weight of debt as drowning, leading some to avoid checking their bank accounts or seeking help due to feelings of guilt and shame. Beyond mental health, financial stress takes a toll on physical well-being. Chronic stress is linked to high blood pressure, heart disease, and a weakened immune system. Financial hardship increases the risk of premature death by 46%. It also strains relationships, contributing to higher divorce rates and family conflicts. Yet, because financial stress is invisible, it's often overlooked, even though its effects are as debilitating as any physical illness. When millions live in survival mode, it's not just a personal crisis, it's a national one. Solutions that could work. If there's one thing the COVID-19 pandemic proved, it's that poverty is not an inevitability. It is a policy choice. During the height of the crisis, direct government assistance programs lifted 45.4 million Americans out of poverty. Then, when those programs were cut, poverty levels shot back up. This raises a fundamental question. If the U.S. can reduce poverty when it chooses to, why doesn't it do so permanently? History and international comparisons show that smart policy decisions can make a real difference. One of the most straightforward solutions is raising the minimum wage to a true living wage. By keeping wages artificially low, the government is forcing millions of full-time workers to live in poverty. Raising the minimum wage to a level that actually allows people to afford housing, food, and healthcare would immediately reduce financial hardship for millions. Universal basic income is another idea that has gained attention in recent years. The concept is simple: provide a guaranteed income to all citizens, regardless of employment status, to cover basic needs. Pilot programs in cities like Stockton, California, have shown that UBI reduces financial stress, improves employment outcomes, and boosts local economies. While critics argue that a guaranteed income could disincentivize work, research from these programs has consistently shown that people continue working, but with greater financial stability and flexibility. Other crucial policies include affordable housing initiatives, stronger healthcare protections, and student loan relief. Housing costs have surged by over 149% since 1985, making homeownership nearly impossible for younger generations. Similarly, universal healthcare, which nearly every other developed nation has adopted, would remove one of the biggest financial burdens Americans face. Debt relief, particularly for student loans, could also free up disposable income that millions of borrowers are currently using to pay off interest. With $1.7 trillion in student debt, young Americans are delaying homeownership, family planning, and retirement savings, all of which have long-term economic consequences. Canceling or significantly reducing student debt would not only relieve financial stress, but also boost economic activity, as more people would have the ability to invest in their futures. Ultimately, the key to reducing poverty isn't a mystery. It's a matter of political will. The U.S. has the resources to implement policies that lift people out of poverty, but the question remains: will policymakers choose to prioritize economic security for all, or will they continue to let millions struggle in a broken system? Until meaningful action is taken, poverty in America will remain a policy failure, one that could be fixed, if only there was the collective will to do so.